Good afternoon, New York, and the rest of our listeners around the globe. My name is June Stoyer, and I'm the host of the Organic View Radio Show. Our podcast is available on iTunes, Zune, and you can also visit our website at www.theorganicview.com. If you have any questions for our guests, there are many ways you can contact the show. You can post a question on our wall on Facebook, Skype us, send us a tweet on Twitter to @TheOrganicView, or you can contact me directly at June Stoyer. If you'd like to be on the show or would like to find out about sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at questions@theorganicview.com. On today's show, I'm going to talk to Jeff Anderson, the owner of California Minnesota Honey Farms, which is a commercial migratory beekeeping operation. Jeff also represents the beekeeping industry on the National Beekeeping Advisory Board and the National Pollinator Defense Fund. Today, he's going to talk about what is life like for a commercial beekeeper. So, I'd like to welcome to the show Mr. Jeff Anderson. Good afternoon, Jeff, and welcome back to the show.
Yeah, good afternoon, June, and thanks for having me.
Jeff, it is always a pleasure to have you on the show, and without people such as yourself, the commercial migratory beekeepers that are located not only here in America, but around the world, we're fortunate enough to enjoy many of the foods that we love, especially during the holidays. Jeff, could you share with our audience a little bit about your work as a beekeeper and how long you've been a beekeeper?
I think I'll start with your questions in reverse. I started beekeeping full-time directly out of high school in 1976 and married into a beekeeping family and eventually ended up buying the business, which I now own. It's kind of an interesting lifestyle, one that probably a lot of your listeners have little knowledge of, and I guess that's why we're doing the show today.
Jeff, how has your involvement with the bees led you to become an advocate for other issues?
The issues surrounding bees are kind of interesting because bees are actually a pretty good environmental indicator of the health of the environment that they forage in. I've had several times during the course of my beekeeping career, I've had issues where the environment's become contaminated, and we actually had to step forward and try and alter the way pesticides were being used in the area. That's probably what pushed me into advocacy here, is the need to try and clean up the area where my bees forage.
How many bees do you manage currently?
Beekeepers talk about it in the context of hives. Generally, I try and get my hive count in the year close to about 3,000 colonies. Each beehive, depending on the time of year, could have 30 to 50,000 bees in it when they're at their high point of the population during the year. So quite a few bees, actually.
How expensive is it to run your operation?
There's quite a bit involved cost-wise. We get a chance to see quite a few dollars go through, but we don't get a chance to hang on to very many of them, and that's probably been exacerbated here with the huge abnormal losses that not just my operation, but beekeeping in general has experienced here in the last 8 or 9 years.
From what I understand, this is a family operation, and you actually have to travel. What is it like to travel so much with your entire family, and what are some of the things that you'd like to share with our audience that they may not even be aware of when it comes to your work as a commercial beekeeper?
I take my whole family with me, and you're correct, it is a family operation. I have hired, in the past, I've had people that were like my son's brother-in-law on my thing, but currently it's all my personal family. We travel less than some of the migratory bee operations because we actually have a base of operation in California, and we have a base of operation in the central part of Minnesota. And in Minnesota, our primary focus is on production of honey during the summer months. And in California, our whole focus is on crop pollination. We pollinate several crops, almonds, cherries, apples, and some blueberries in California. Basically, I'm based at two different places during the year, roughly 6 months in each place, California and Minnesota. There are other operations that add one or two more points into that, and some operations that simply make their whole income doing crop pollination, and they may make as many as 5 moves in a year.
How many hours a day are you in the fields? Exactly. What time do you try to head out, and what time do you actually come back home, or inside, should I say?
Well, that varies depending on what we're doing. If we're actually in the process of doing crop pollination, our day can get to be rather long because it's easiest to move bees when they're during the evening night hours when they're home naturally, because we don't have to restrict the entrances of the hives or anything. And so I'm trying to give you a snapshot of like our California pollination. My actual residence is within about 30 to 50 miles of where my bees are located when we are not in crop pollination, and we're about the same distance or less to the crop that we pollinate. So we only have to actually physically shuttle the hives maybe 60 miles. And so what we'll generally do is in the late afternoon, just after the bees have quit flying for the day, we'll go out and actually load them on the trucks. I generally use a couple of smaller trucks that are capable of hauling about 80 beehives each. And then I actually have some large trucks, semi-trucks that we utilize as well that will haul, depending on needs of the pollination that we're going to, 400 to 500 colonies on the larger trucks. And so we will load those up in the evening, bring them back to my place, sleep during the night. Generally, we can be done loading, particularly in the spring of the year when the sun is down by 5 o'clock, we can be loaded and back to the place by 7:30 or 8. But then we have to get up early in the morning in order to deliver them before bees actually start flying. And depending on which crop and how late in the spring, the early crops are easier because if we're done placing bees by, say, 9:30 in the morning, we're good. Some of the later crops like cherries and apples, we have to be done earlier because the daylight hours are longer, and so it shortens up the night on the later crops. And then during the daytime, I generally try and not do a lot or at least not have my crew do a lot when we're actually shuttling bees, because you can easily get in 8 hours worth of actual time moving, both in the morning and the evening. But occasionally you'll have a problem with a flat tire or something that needs repair, and because we are a small operation and we do all that stuff in-house, occasionally the day gets longer if you have to repair something during the day to be prepared to do your next move the following night.
And this is nonstop. It's not like you take a coffee break at 10:15, have lunch at 12, high tea in the afternoon, so on and so forth. This is just nonstop physical labor.
Yeah, not so much when we're actually migrating the bees. I generally catch breakfast with my wife after I'm done moving bees in the morning, and lunch. Often I'll grab a sandwich and take with me in the evening when we go to load. That's one of the things I like about this business is the fact that I can involve my family, and my kids have been involved in coming out and helping and doing this work with me as well. And when they were younger, for instance, I would take, one in the evening and a different child with me in the morning so that I wouldn't wear them out. But they would do the simple things like helping tie or untie the load or smoking the bees. And now I've been kind of relegated to do some of that. All of my kids are pretty proficient operating equipment, forklifts. I know I've got a daughter that's in her early 20s, and she has been driving my little trucks through orchards and backing trailers and things like that since she was probably in her early teens. And I know a lot of her male friends are jealous of the fact that she can back a trailer around the yard faster than they can drive the truck forward around the yard. So there are some things that practical things that are really nice about having a family business like this. There are parts of the process that are pretty inflexible and actually not all that palatable as well. And part of what I said about pollination is true, that, we work morning and we work evening and we try and work a little less during the daytime. But the other part of pollination that I didn't mention is the fact that the reason growers are renting our bees is to set their crop, and there is some timing issues that can be involved in that. The most crops that require insect pollination their best set is during the first 72 hours that a blossom is open. So timing is everything, because growers often do not want the bees present until bloom begins, but that makes a very narrow window of time of when you can place the bees. And so for that reason, often it's rain or shine, and California springs used to be, you could count on a little bit of moisture and fog in the morning and whatnot. Often when I place bees in the spring, when you're running the forklift, you're in insulated coveralls with your gloves on because it's 37 degrees and foggy out, and you must get the bees on the ground before the fog burns off and the temperature goes up. And I know another thing that kind of comes to mind here is when we actually make our migration to and from Minnesota. In order to make it cost effective, we utilize two large trucks, two semi-trucks, and haul bees one direction, and then we load one truck on the other and haul it back to get the next load of bees. And when we do that, we try and make a round trip a week, and it's a 1,900-mile run one way.
Yeah, and you can't exactly stop wherever you feel like.
Well, with bees, we have to keep the load moving during the daylight hours for the same reason we have to move them during the night hours. We have to keep air moving over the bees to keep them cooled off, to keep them in the hives. We put a large net that goes completely over the load to keep the bees with the hives, that the ones that do come out, and mostly that's for protection of the public in case we have bees fly off and we don't have stray bees that we leave. But on our return trip, in order to make a round trip, it takes us 3 days. We put one driver in a truck with bees, and we drive daylight hours. And but there again, you don't stop in the daylight with bees. We get breakfast and fuel before the bees become active in the morning, and our trucks carry enough fuel that we don't have to stop for the day. We fuel once a day. We'll generally, in the spring, if it gets warm, we put a garden soaker hose on our loads, and we actually wet them down in the morning so that there's plenty of moisture on the loads. A lot of people don't think about this, but bees need quite a bit of moisture to maintain their hives. If I'm going to use the term loosely, dry a load of bees out, the bees become frantic because they need water. And so there's little tricks to the trade, such as dampening the load real well in the morning that keep the bees much happier during the day. We do all those things, but you don't stop for lunch and go in and to a restaurant and sit down for an hour. You can smother a load of bees in that length of time. And so the bees actually have to keep moving all day. And then in the evening, about sundown, the bees naturally, when they would naturally come back to the hive, they become dormant on the truck, and we're able to stop. So when we actually have bees on our trucks headed to or from Minnesota, we have to keep the bees moving during the daylight hours, particularly in the spring of the year when the temperatures are warm. And we don't have an option to stop for lunch. If you feel like you need something for lunch, you better have it in the truck, because you can't stop with a load of bees during the daytime. You can smother a load in a relatively short period of time. The other thing I want to briefly mention is on our return trip, we put two drivers in a truck and we drive straight back, and it takes about 33 to 36 hours to do that. And there's been time at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're headed back. You're wondering why you're keeping bees at all, because it seems like that's a good time to be sleeping as opposed to working.
Now, especially with all the labor that's involved, it's the same thing as with any type of agricultural operation. I know growing up on a farm, when we had to bale hay, we didn't have the luxury back then of the technology that they have today where you can bale the round bales. We had the square bales. And if you cut and dried hay, you only had so much time. And I remember as a kid working 3 days without sleep. My hands were swollen. And I worked with my brother and my dad and my other brother actually to bale the hay and get it in the barn, get it salted, and that was how we fed our cows in the winter. And if by chance your hay was rained on, you couldn't use it. You could not store it. I mean, you could feed it to the cows, but it was not something that you could use for the winter. So the elements were a very big concern. And as you're describing about the traveling with the bees, once again, you can't stop and get a latte, go shopping at the local mall, what have you. You have to drive straight through, and the health of the bees is the number one concern. So, of course, especially as the temperatures are rising, water is a very big issue as well as food.
Yes. Well, I mean, the answer to your question is, yeah, both water and food are important. I mean, the time on the truck is short enough that the bees can tolerate not foraging for 2 or 3 days. But water is absolutely critical because bees can't go along without water for any length of time.
Can you talk about the actual process of pollinating the crops? Exactly how early do you have to get up when it's time to head out to the fields, and what is it like to be in the fields all day long, regardless of what the elements may be like?
Well, there again, it depends on which crop we're pollinating. Almonds, we generally start about 6 o'clock in the morning, and if we're pollinating some of the later pollinations, we have to start at least an hour earlier than that, 5 or a little bit more, because daylight comes quicker. You know, like I mentioned earlier in our chat here, we have to place bees regardless of what the weather's doing. We do watch the long-range forecast, and if we see a weather system coming in and we have the opportunity to work ahead of that, sometimes we'll put in some longer hours and get bees placed so we're not actually fighting the rain or whatever. The later pollinations, we don't have that option because our bees, for instance, are pollinating an almond crop and need to move to cherries, and a lot of times the bloom overlaps, and so the almond growers often will let us have a portion of the bees, but not all of them, and we use those to catch the early bloom in the next pollination. And so sometimes we actually pick up bees out of an orchard 2 or 3 different times as the bloom recedes, and we actually sometimes we'll place like twice in the same crop. You know, we put a few bees in early to catch the early bloom, but by the time the bulk of the bloom comes in, we have to get the rest of the bees placed that are needed. And most crops pollinated use about 2 hives of bees per acre. So it's not like you just pick up the bees and you know, one place and you drop them at one place. We actually have to disperse them out to the various orchards. Yeah, and that's where the time comes in.
In regards to the point where you're ready to harvest the honey, how labor-intensive is that process, and could you just share a little bit about that process with our audience, especially for people who have no idea what it's like to extract honey?
Yeah, I think I'll back that up a little bit because I think it'd make more sense to talk about that based on the full honey season. We bring our bees to Minnesota for the honey production, and we arrive in early May, and we watch what the weather's doing in the Midwest there before we bring bees back there for several reasons. One is that obviously the spring doesn't always come on the same day of the calendar every year, you know, and we need the temperature up and bloom progression or spring progression along because we want to get there when things are happening as opposed to snow still on the ground. But in general terms, what that means is we get bees basically to Minnesota about the 1st of May. It actually takes us probably a week or 10 days to disperse the bees on the various farms where they stay. And in Minnesota, once we place the bees on a particular farm, they're there for the full duration of the summer. And it's not like we pick them up and move them during the summer. So our initial work is actually getting the bees dispersed out onto the various farms. That's followed up pretty quickly with we go back through and we split the bees in California to make up our losses for the year. So the hives come back to Minnesota in one box. Generally, most of the year, the beehive is allowed to have two boxes to operate in. And so mid-May and into the 1st of June, we go through and we give the bees more room. We give them another box to work in. We sort out the hives that have lost their queens, and early in the season, we try and establish a new queen in the colony so that our numbers will stay higher. By the middle of June, we need to have those hives pretty well established, and they need to be getting populous. It takes a lot of bees in the colony to make honey, and so we want our bees to be populous by early to mid-June. Our honey flows in Minnesota are generally start about the 1st of July. The ones that we actually use to extract that we sell, to the public. And there are things that bloom earlier, things like dandelions, for instance, which the bees do quite well on and they build up quite well on. But the dandelion honey, depending on year, can be kind of offensive in taste, so we leave that to the hives and let them use that for their own use. About the 1st to the middle of June, then we put what's called a queen excluder on our colony, which keeps the queen restricted to the bottom two boxes, and then we add additional boxes for honey storage. We make 2 or 3 rounds to each hive in June and July, adding additional supers, and then we kind of leave the hives alone from about the 3rd week of July till about the middle of August, at which point we then go out and we take the honey off.
How much honey is produced from one hive?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, actually, because the hives are producing quite a bit less honey than they used to. The old rule of thumb when I first went to work in bees in Minnesota was that you could place a hive of bees pretty much anywhere in the state and expect to produce 100 surplus pounds of honey on it. When you put them in a commercial setting where you're putting more hives together at one spot, we generally put 32 to 40 hives of bees on one farm. It causes the bees to have to be able to fly a little further to forage, and it also cuts down on the production. So at that point in life, we would generally get 85 pounds of honey per hive. In recent years now, our average crop has slid down to where we're in the mid to upper 60-pound range, and we've had some years where we've had crops as low as 35 pounds per hive. That's a number that can slide dependent on quite a few factors. And probably we ought to talk about the factors a little bit because, I mentioned early on that I've had pesticide issues that we had to stand up and say no about, and I think that's one of the primary factors that's causing our honey production to slide is we have hives that are less healthy than they used to be.
There are a number of hobbyist beekeepers who feel that the commercial beekeepers are obviously not producing as much honey as they produce. So can you explain to our audience the significant difference between a commercial beekeeper and a hobbyist and why a hobbyist might have a different yield than the commercial beekeeper?
Well, honeybees are one of the pollinating insects that forage for quite some distance. If you want to get an organic label for your honey, you have to be able to document what has been applied in the area of pesticides for a 4-mile radius. And so honeybees can actually forage and make a gain at 4 miles. And that's a pretty commonly accepted fact. But they're also forage efficient. The less number of colonies there are in an area, the shorter distance the bees are required to forage in order to be efficient. Anytime you add additional competition, the bees have to fly further. And so if a hobbyist has 1 or 2 colonies in their backyard, as opposed to a commercial migratory beekeeper having 40 colonies in the same location, obviously the 40 colonies are going to have to compete significantly more for the same available forage, which causes them to forage further, which then makes them less efficient, which is probably the explanation for why hobbyists would produce more honey in the same areas as a commercial beekeeper would.
Now, that also lends itself to the argument that Why do we even have commercial beekeepers when we can just rely upon the native pollinators?
Native pollinators are also in significant decline here, and nobody really has a good handle on exactly how much of a decline because they don't have anybody that consistently looks at them. And so it's probably useful to pay attention to how much trouble the managed honeybees are having, because I know the farmers in my area in Minnesota, most of them recognize the fact that if they want to take a alfalfa crop into seed or something, that they need managed honeybees there because the local bumblebee populations and stuff are not near what they used to be. And I think that's environmentally caused. The problem is that the natives have no one to do what I would call beekeeping heroics to try and replenish their populations. They're doing it naturally, and they're losing the war. The other thing I would say about that is that because of our agricultural system where we monocrop so intensely, there's no way, even if that part were not true and the natives were doing just fine, most of the native pollinators do not forage in the same range that honeybees do. For instance, if you take a blue orchard bee, a quarter of a mile is considered a long range for a blue orchard bee. Almond growers are kind of experimenting with blue orchard bees as a supplement to honeybees, or taking over for their pollination on their almond crops, and they're starting to realize that managed honeybees, even though they may not be quite as efficient, are hugely important because we can bring them in adequate volume to set a monocrop system.
If you were to lose all of your honeybees and were forced to hand pollinate, would that even be possible? And if so, what would be involved?
The Chinese actually do hand pollination. They've got several things to their favor. One is that their population there is pretty high.
They can exploit very cheap labor,
and
people can just deal with it because it's a communist country. I've been there.
Right. Unless you've seen the pollinations crops. I mean, if you've been in the Northeast and seen blueberries where they're raised, up in the mountains and nothing but blueberries, and get an idea of actually how many flowers are out there. On the West Coast here, our big pollination is almonds, and I mean, we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 800,000 acres of almond trees, and 135 to 150 trees per acre, and how many blossoms per tree. I mean, the logistics of it are impossible. I mean, to do that with human pollination ain't going to happen.
Even if you were to collect the pollen and distribute it, would there be even enough time to pollinate the crops? No,
it's not going to happen. We, for crops that require insect pollination, and we monocrop them, it's just not going to happen on a commercial basis.
I know from my own experiences looking at my own blueberry bushes, watching the bees pollinate those bushes. As I'm photographing them, I can't even keep up with how many bees are coming to the bushes and how quickly they work. I don't understand even how people can even think that that would be an option. What we have in nature has already been perfected, and to try to replicate that is just really ridiculous.
Yes.
Can you talk about the actual process extracting the honey and how many hours it takes to produce, say, 1 pint of honey?
Okay. Extracting honey is we do that with some fairly efficient equipment as well. I mentioned that we put boxes on the hives and whatnot. We probably have an average of 2 boxes that we have to extract the honey out of, and that's about 1 box less than we used to 20 years ago. And inside of each box, there's a frame that's removable, and we have machinery that will take the wax cap off. When the bees fill the little hexagon cells with honey, they put a wax cap over it, and in order to get the honey back out, you have to remove that wax cap. We have equipment that will take and cut the wax caps off of both sides of the frame at the same time. Then the comb is put into a centrifugal, we call them extractor, and uses centrifugal force to actually physically sling the honey out of the frame. We generally warm the the honey to make it come out of the frames better, we warm it up to about close to 100 degrees. And with the equipment I have, and having 3 to 5 people, I just put in some newer equipment here a couple of years ago, and my new system, I generally have to have 5 people operating it. We can extract out about 500 boxes of honey in a single day.
And if you think about the labor that's involved with 5 people and the amount of honey, if you were to equate that to a job, say, in corporate America, what would the wage be?
That's a good question, because if it's in a union...
People need to hear this, Jeff.
Well,
People need to hear this.
They probably do need to hear this. I mean, obviously, we're not union shop, and we don't pay $30 an hour. We're down...
But how about those benefits and your pension and all the other perks that you will never see? Not to mention, if you could share this with our audience, what happens if you get sick, Jeff? Who takes over for you?
Nobody. That's it exactly, and that's kind of interesting. I just twisted my ankle earlier this fall, and I went in to get it checked out, and they were saying, well, is your work comp going to pick up on that? Well, most people don't realize this, but if you're in self-employed, your work comp pays for your employees, but it don't pay for the boss. And things like Social Security, a lot of people gripe about how much the federal government takes out of their check, but they don't realize that the employer is paying half of the bill. And self-employed people pay the whole bill. So there's a lot of things like health insurance. Health insurance is big in the national thing right now. We can't find ways to get into group plans that make health insurance adequately affordable. Yeah, the new system that's being proposed here is not any better. So yeah, there's all those kinds of issues. So
bottom line is the work that you're doing. Once again, if you didn't have a passion for it, it's very difficult to keep doing the things that you're doing, especially when you look at the bottom line wage that you're making. It really does not amount to much of all. Are you even getting paid, would you say, minimum wage at this point?
Well, I probably make minimum wage, yes, but the other thing I would like to throw out there is that with these abnormal bee losses and stuff that we've had, we adjust. You mentioned, growing up on a farm, and if you've got short years, you don't buy new tractors, and the same thing is true here in the bee business. If you have a really good year, you buy the new truck you need or the new forklift that you need. And, to kind of give you an idea, my very newest truck in my fleet is a 2008 model, So that's things that don't occur all that frequently. And the other thing I would tell you is with the abnormal mortality, I actually sat down the other day because I've been in and testified before EPA and a couple times before legislators in my home state of Minnesota and whatnot, and they wanted a fix on basically how much this abnormal mortality has been cutting into our gross income. And sometimes it's better not to look at those kinds of things, but basically we've been defunded by about 3/4 in shortfall in our honey production, and when we do crop pollination, growers don't pay for dead hives.
Who absorbs those costs, Jeff?
Pardon?
Who absorbs the costs when you have dead hives?
Well, the beekeeper initially absorbs it all. We have passed some of that on in the form of increased pollination fees, but that hasn't covered our shortfalls. The point of income and the point of expenses are fast reaching the point where they're getting to be parallel and practically touching each other.
At this point, wouldn't you say that you're working 3 times as hard not to get ahead, but just to stay in business?
Well, that is true. The other thing I would like your listeners to know is that, it's disheartening when you go out, you get a hive of bees, you spent $50 in resources getting a hive of bees looking like it's going to make a crop of honey for you, and then you get a pesticide exposure that knocks it down where it makes you a third of the crop that it should, and took out 35 to 40, actually killed 35 to 40% of the hives in a bee yard. I've got some of my older adult children that enjoyed working bees that are doing things like auto body now because they couldn't tolerate doing a good job and then having taken out of your hands. And so there's that factor in it too.
What control do you have when it comes to the pesticide exposure?
Unfortunately, we have like zero control because EPA is charged with regulating pesticides in the United States, and they pretty much have abdicated their job. There's good rules on the books that are intended to protect pollinators. Probably a lot of your listeners have gotten home and garden products that they looked at, and often there will be a warning in the environmental hazard statement that would indicate, please do not apply this to bloom. They use various words. The problem is that for the most part, most people think that's just advice, and because it's advice, we don't need to take it. And in agriculture and in much of the United States, not so much in our pollinated crops, but in much of the rest of the United States, pesticide exposures become the norm. And the concept is gradually shifting to the point where they feel like that pollinators should just move away when a farmer wants to make a pesticide application.
Are you always given notice about the pesticide applications?
No, and even if you are given notice, I've got bees, and like for instance in Minnesota, when we have bees on locations, I've got bees on 75 different farms, and that's part of the national discussion right now. EPA wants the stakeholders all to get in the same room and sing kumbaya. Many of the other growers feel like that, if they can just simply call a beekeeper and get him to move his hives, and they can make an application of pesticides that are toxic to pollinators. And that's partly why our native pollinator populations go in the toilet, because that attitude persists. What really needs to happen is adherence to the label, because you can still do crop protection, but it has to be done out of the context of bloom, or if you use short residual pesticides and apply them at night, you can reduce the pest population in a crop without killing your pollinators, which are active in the daytime.
Jeff, I'm just curious, if you were a rancher instead of a commercial beekeeper, what would be the difference if you lost your animals?
Well, it's kind of interesting that you would ask that, because, for instance, I've got a beekeeper friend in Utah, and they have problems with things getting in and killing the sheep and stuff. And what happens for a sheep grower is tax dollars pay for the animal, and they pay for the lost income for 3 years. If I lose a beehive, there is no corresponding way to help put us back on our feet. We just have to absorb the loss and move forward. And that's true in lots of crops. The row crops like corn and soy, you can buy crop protection, or through the government that will supplement it if you have a failed crop. We can buy crop insurance for our actual lost honey production, but it's based on our live colony. So if we lose a colony to pesticide, that's taken out of the mix. So the playing field is not exactly level.
So the bottom line is beekeepers really don't have any protection.
Very little.
Jeff, what are your concerns for the upcoming year?
Well, it's a lot of the same concerns that we had for quite some time. Is, in order to make this cost effective, we have to be able to produce a number of live viable colonies and keep them healthy through the year. Currently, there's no relief from pesticides, and look that we can see in the in the grand scheme. EPA is not really positioning to help us out, even though that's what they're charged with doing. There is a little glimmer of hope in the fact that there's at least becoming a discussion at the national level about improving forage for pollinators. There's been a fairly significant misunderstanding by many of the agencies about the value of having flowering forage for pollinators, and a lot of our CRP lands and stuff have basically gone to grasses, which have no value for pollinators, and if you have CRP land next to monocrops, pretty much you eliminate native pollinators. And there's starting to become a recognition that scenario has to change. And if it changes and we can start planting our road right-of-ways and public lands into pollinator forage, and perhaps, I mean, there's even been some discussion about getting the Farm Bill written in a way where farmers there'd be a financial incentive for setting back certain, 1% or 5% of their land into pollinator forage to help turn the corner here on the continuing decline.
Jeff, do you have any suggestions for the farming community as far as better crop management that would be more conducive to healthier bees?
Well, actually, I do, because part of our monocrop system here is we've got, not only are we monocropping, but we're doing it year after year, the same crop on the same land, which is part of the reason that we have more pesticide use that's toxic to pollinators. Because anytime you put a crop out there consistently year after year, any of the pests that are common to that crop have unlimited forage, basically, and their population's going to expand. So crop rotation is one thing that would help that. The other thing is that we need to get away from the current paradigm we have in how we use pesticides, because we're using pesticides these days as preventatives. When we originally started using pesticides back in the World War II era, it was for pest eradication. Under the eradication process, if you had a problem with pests in your crop, you'd go out, you'd spray a pesticide. It was toxic. It was bad for the environment, all those things, but it was only that for 2 or 3 days or a week. Under the prevention paradigm, we're using pesticides that are way more persistent. A lot of the ones that probably are causing the biggest problem for beekeepers right now and pollinators in general is one of the things that are probably most problematic for beekeepers right now in the area of pesticides is the fact that we've gone to using preventative pesticides, and in many cases that's things like the systemic neonicotinoids, which are either sprayed or used as seed treatments on crops. And those types of pesticides are present in the crop pretty much for the full life cycle of the plant, from all the way up through harvest time. That's a lot of the issue that we see in the beekeeping community, and probably in pollinators in general, is the fact that they have these low-grade level of toxins present in a good portion of their food supply for all the full season.
Thank you. Jeff, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to come on the show to share a little bit about what your life is like as a commercial migratory beekeeper. Do you have anything that you'd like to share with our audience this upcoming Thanksgiving and Christmas season for people when they are enjoying the different family recipes and whatnot?
Well, yeah, actually, I think we do, and that is that, a lot of our tastiest foods are insect pollinated, and probably our healthiest foods are insect pollinated. And probably when you're enjoying that apple pie, the apple wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the pollination process. Or, I mean, you can go the cranberry salad that's on the table. The cranberry would be in trouble without pollination, and I was going to say the walnuts, but the walnuts are actually wind pollinated. But a lot of your nuts, almonds in particular, some of the other nut crops, insect pollinated. All those things would disappear. And so, I mean, while we're enjoying the meal, it would probably be good to think about where that came from, and probably vote with your checkbook at the supermarket. Insist on products that are raised in a wholesome manner.
Jeff, can you talk briefly about the National Beekeeping Advisory Board and the National Pollinator Defense Fund really quickly so that people can get more involved and support your efforts there?
Yes. I'm a member of both of those boards. The two national organizations, the American Beekeeping Federation and the American Honey Producers Organization, realized that we needed to get a single voice back in Washington, D.C. on these issues, and so they formed the National Honeybee Advisory Board, which has been in existence now for about 5 years. We have regular conversations with decision makers back in particularly the EPA. It seemed like the conversation was running just a bit slow, so there was a recognition that we needed to be able to amp that discussion up, and so because the National Honeybee Advisory Board is advice only, and that was our whole purpose, was to advise not only EPA on pesticide issues, but our national organizations on ways that we should probably deal with them, which caused the inception of the second group, which is the National Pollinator Defense Fund, which has recently been renamed to Pollinator Stewardship Council. I mean, you can find us on either website, but Pollinator Stewardship Council actually is a nonprofit, and we do solicit funds to work with the issues at the national level. And probably the quickest way would be to just tell your listeners to get online and Google us and read what we're about.
There will be links to both organizations actually with this interview, which you can find on theorganicview.com. So that should make it easier for people to get more involved, learn about the organizations, and also, if you can, donate to the funds. Jeff, thank you once again for coming on the show, and I'd like to just take a moment to wish you and your family a very happy Thanksgiving and also a very Merry Christmas.
And thanks so much for having me, Joan.
You're very welcome. And folks, thank you for tuning in. This has been June Stoyer with the Organic View Radio Show. Have a great afternoon, everyone.